Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. It's been a wild few weeks for the Welsh Conservative Party, with their then leader and chief whip being embroiled at the centre of an alleged lockdown rule breach. Those two received the full backing of the Welsh Conservative group only for another allegation to be levelled at them. The following day, Paul Davies resigned as leader. In what felt like no time at all, their former leader was their new leader, with Andrew R.T. Davies announced as the new Tory-in-chief in Cardiff Bay. While anti-devolution and anti-Senedd sentiment seem to be coming into the fore in Wales, Boris Johnson is continuing his largely unsuccessful campaign in Scotland to persuade Scots that their future lies under the Westminster government rather than an independent Scottish one. Both the Unionists and the Union are experiencing difficult times. Joining me, Rich and Kerry this evening is Theo Davies-Lewis of Darogan. He's written extensively on Wales, Welsh politics and the future of the Union, and it's great to have him here with us this evening. Hello, Theo.
Good evening, that's with that.
Evening, Kerry.
Good evening, Matthew.
Evening, Richard.
Good evening, all.
So let's start with obviously the big story, which is the Tories. It was a difficult week for them with losing their Senedd leader, reappointing their old one, and they've been embroiled in a few internal debates and disagreements about the future direction of the party in Wales. In an election year, this doesn't look like a huge recipe for success, does it?
No, of course not. I mean, it's a terrible week, and I think it's crisis after crisis, really, for the party at the minute. And I think they know that. There was lots of stuff flowing in on social media after the booze scandal in the Senedd tea room about, all these grassroots officials saying that Paul Davies, Darren Miller, they all had to go, and eventually that they did. And I think now, obviously, with Andrew R.T. coming back, you've had this sort of continued underlying current of where the party is going ahead of the Senedd election and afterwards. And the issue, of course, as you mentioned in the introduction, is that, that current of abolishing the Welsh Parliament in their ranks. And I think, obviously, you've seen, and as we'll discuss, lots of new candidates emerging that actually now support getting rid of that Parliament, and then Liberal Conservatives being deselected or not selected for different seats. So there's lots of question marks around the party. I mean, there's actually electoral difficulties ahead of them. There's no question about that. But I think there's obviously a more fundamental question as well about where the party goes over the next few weeks. And I think the biggest problem for them is that they don't know themselves. We had Glyn Davies last week on Politics Wales saying that the Welsh Conservative Party is a pro-devolution party. But then, of course, we've had different events, even in the last 24 hours, regarding members such as Susie Davis and whether they're standing for the Senedd. So it's kind of, the rhetoric and the evidence doesn't line up. So it is going to be very, very difficult for them. And they've got no more than 100 days, really, until the election. So they better sort themselves out ahead of then if they're looking to get more seats than last time.
As a Davis, I was slightly disappointed with the Davis furore in the Conservative Party. Yeah, I don't know if it is bad times ahead. Preparing for tonight, I looked at some of the figures for the Tories going back. They've got a pretty consistent vote in Wales. And so it makes you wonder where their vote would go. If people are appalled and put off by what's happening with Boozegate, will it go over to the other right-wing parties? Or will it just, the changes have been put in? They've put R.T. Davies in, but he is popular, I think, amongst the Conservative Party in Wales, and he might put them back on a footing. But it might not gain them votes in May, but will it really push people into a different party? I'm not so sure. I think the bigger issues with the Conservatives are bigger policy issues, which we talk about on the pod and look to coming up to election. The Conservative government in London, how they're doing on the pandemic, the union, those kind of issues, I think, will dwarf Boozegate in due course. But it's obviously not ideal.
Yeah, I think Carrie's point about the Conservative vote being pretty consistent as a percentage of turnout, I think is the kind of key one, because the Conservatives must be thinking not how can we necessarily extend our vote, because they haven't won an election in Wales for a century, so it's not like they're going to win. But what they can do is at least get their voters who vote in Westminster elections out for a Senedd election. And that might be why we're seeing the kind of unsubtlety in the way that they're positioning the party ahead of the Senedd elections. I mean, they're painting with the clearest colours exactly what kind of party they think their members want. And I think it's not unfair to say that the Senedd group has not been representative in any way of the membership for 20 years. Arguably, you can say that's true of the Conservative group in Westminster, but I think we're seeing in Westminster that MPs are becoming more like the membership, and I think it certainly would appear, if you look at the candidate list, that while the Senedd members that may be returned to the Senedd will not be of the same age profile as their membership, they may have the same kind of strength of views over the future of devolution and some of the more salient issues of the last few years since and including Brexit.
Matt, so I referred to R.T. Davies in my thoughts on the whole scenario. What are your take on him being made leader again? Is that gonna flow as I suggested, or do you think there's more to it?
I think it was the most obvious thing that could ever have happened to the Welsh Conservatives. I think there was talk already of a coup being taken place because of so many sort of anti-devolution candidates becoming candidates for the Welsh Conservatives in the Senedd election, and I think it felt inevitable. Even if this hadn't have happened, it felt like at some point after the election, if they hadn't done as well as they may have wanted to do, there would have been some attempt to dethrone Paul Davies. It just so happened that a scandal that happened a month before that no one was really talking about until it came out was the straw that broke the camel's back. Actually, what the straw that broke the camel's back was the second allegation after they'd given him their full backing. So I don't think anyone's surprised by R.T. Davies's retaking of the throne. So I think it was inevitable and no one's surprised.
Theo, can I ask, how much of what we saw with Paul Davies's ousting was choreographed, and how much of it was coincidental?
I think that's difficult to say, isn't it? But I do genuinely think that, the Conservative group in the Senedd, if you read the reports that came out, I mean, apparently they actually hadn't seen the Senedd Commission's findings about the investigation before they made their decision. But obviously I couldn't comment on the validity of those reports. But I think there was probably a realization when you're in a kind of crisis like that they had to try and stick with their leader if they can, because it's panic stations, and it says a lot about the Conservative group that they just basically sided with their leader, and they could have gotten rid of him then. That would have been the easy decision, just to oust him right there and then with what was happening. I wrote a piece, about 12 hours before Paul Davies resigned, no way linked to his resignation, of course. But for me, it was more the issue of the fact that the story ran away from them, and they completely lost the narrative. Because I'm sure, if you look at the statement that Paul Davies and Darren Millar made after they resigned, you kind of actually, if you're a decent person, probably felt slightly bad for them, because obviously I'm sure they weren't doing what The Sun and Guido Fawkes were all illustrating, making them out to have this huge booze up, although we don't know all the facts around it. But at the end of the day, it was a narrative which they lost control of. The story was completely gone. People had created that media storm. The grassroots had made their decision, and he had to go. And I think obviously, having Andrew R.T. coming back, and I agree with what Matt and Carrie said, that he was the obvious choice. I suppose for him now, like I said to begin with, it's a decision he's got to make about where the party goes, because you're right to say that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of small C Conservatives out there that will always turn out for the party. We saw that in 2019. The interesting thing, if we're going to take Glyn Davies's word for it, and that Welsh Conservatives are going to, be a part of Welsh democracy, they're going to be participants. They've got to do what all parties have got to do to get power, which is to compromise and make deals, because that's how you get into the Welsh government. I mean, we saw that, we've seen that with the Welsh Labour Party over the last 20 years. That's the reason they're still here. And it's pretty likely, obviously, that they're not going to be able to compromise, and it obviously requires compromise as well from the other parties like Plaid Cymru, and Adam Price clearly doesn't want to do that because he still thinks genuinely he's going to be First Minister. The issue, of course, with Paul Davies and Darren Millar, it's yesterday's story now. There was debates, obviously, over whether they were going to remain candidates. So I think, all the findings will come out, that, all these investigations will happen. It might not be an issue, like Kerry says, ahead of the election. But what will be, I think, this continued lingering matter for them is, do we see a shift miraculously in the next week, which I personally would love to see, for the party to be more progressive and pragmatic. But I doubt that's going to happen.
You mentioned the boozegate. Will it still linger? I don't think it will, simply because it's cross party. You know, there's a stranger in the mix, so it can't really be attacked by the Labour Party as much as it perhaps could have in another situation. I don't think it will linger, but where do you think it leaves those politicians who were involved? Do you think it is going to be pressure on them going forward, or do you think it will just be wiped up as a spilled drink, perhaps?
It's really difficult to say, because I do think it depends, on the processes with Cardiff Council and the Standards Commissioner as well. Because I mean, basically, what they say and what the evidence is, that's what will take the story forward. I mean, for me, I think right now, after a week, I mean, things are happening so quickly, and you mentioned Boris's visit to Scotland. That's overtaken the agenda this week, and there'll be something next week, and there'll be something even an hour after this podcast goes out that changes the narrative again. It's really difficult to see, but I think it does, no matter what happens with the story, I think it is something, important in the midst of a pandemic, that it did shine a spotlight again for the wrong reasons on the Welsh Parliament. I don't know what the Sun said, it was something like Welsh Party was their imaginative headline, and it didn't reflect best on Welsh democracy and Welsh politicians. And it's easy to disregard that sort of thing. But I think it's actually quite important, because up until very recently, I think Wales was still treated like a bit of a joke on the UK stage, and stuff like this doesn't help. Like I said at the time, I think it undermined trust generally. Like you said, obviously the Labour Party were kind of involved in it with Alan Davies as well. It does undermine trust in politicians. And I think a lot of people actually, if you read the media coverage, the social media reaction, and it'd be interesting to see the next polling on it, see if it does have an effect. I think a lot of people were actually really angry with it. No matter whatever the facts really, and what are the concrete facts, the impression is just terrible. Hence, they all said sorry straight away. So I think, it might not be that central election issue, but it perhaps doesn't help all those people that want to abolish the Welsh Parliament, because I saw them very active on social media afterwards saying, well, this is what they think of you in this tea room in the Senate. They're not making decisions, they're going for drinks there. It wasn't a loss really just for the Tory party or the Welsh Labour Party. It was actually a huge impact really on perceptions on politicians and the Welsh Parliament, which is a huge shame, I think.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I had friends and relatives who don't really pay any attention to Welsh politics, and they were talking about Drinksgate with some scorn, and it was damaging to democracy. That's the kind of old guard and where they're positioning themselves. But there's a new batch of Conservative candidates coming into political arena in Wales, and many of them have suggested a hostility to devolution. Have you got any thoughts on how that could play out in this election?
It depends how many of them get elected. I think that, like you guys were talking about, I think this Drinksgate thing has had a bit more effect on confidence in the institution itself rather than the party. Although people did mention Drinksgate to me, I don't think it's quite got the same cultural cut through as Barnard Castle had. And I think actually what it's done is it's damaged the Senedd more than it's damaged the Tories.
It would have been good if we'd had a slightly more imaginative kind of faux pas in Wales. Tea Room Gate isn't really Barnard Castle in any stretch of the imagination, is it?
No, not really. Like you said, a huge amount of anti-Devo candidates coming through the Welsh Conservative ranks. When we did our podcast with a bunch of them, they seem to not be as openly anti-Devo, the ones we spoke to anyway. But I know for certain there are quite a few who are. I've seen some comment today saying that this is a force that I don't think the Welsh Conservatives really understand. They're trying to ride this populist wave of anti-devolution or Devo-skeptic sentiment to try and pick up votes that would have otherwise gone to right-wing parties on the list. And I think they're going to end up with radical right forces that they can't control. And even Andrew R.T. Davies, who is a pound shop populist at the best of times, is going to try and take that on and try and create this balance between the Conservative Party of Nick Bourne and the one of Boris Johnson. And I think he's going to let through this Boris light version of conservatism into the Welsh Tory party, and it will completely overtake them. And I think if enough of those candidates get elected, that's the future of the Welsh Conservative Party for the next 20, 30 years.
I'll throw this over to you, Theo. Do you think that the benefits for the Welsh Conservatives of pursuing this strategy outweigh the negatives?
Well, again, it comes back to actually what they want to achieve, isn't it? I mean, I think they will never get into the Welsh government and become a party of government with sort of an abolitionist sentiment at their heart, and that's the heart. Like, they'll never do it. It just electorally doesn't work. I think really what is happening to the party now is that they're embracing this anti-devolution sentiment, which has always been in its membership for 20 years. We have to remember as well, for as much as I write positive things about David Melding, who's, I listened to his contributions to the podcast last year, and the likes of Nick, now Lord Bourne, these guys were also sceptical of devolution and opposed to devolution for a period before the vote. And obviously, you don't have to sort of go through the well-rehearsed history, but then there was kind of a realism that we're going to have to work with this. And, the likes of Melding realised that, or suggest that the only reason that the union's actually together is actually because of devolution, because that was a pressure on the system of government which required a solution. Obviously now that's been translated into a kind of need for federalism in some ranks of the Labour Party. But these abolitionist candidates, I don't think many of them will actually be elected through the Welsh Conservative ranks personally, but obviously they may get some votes coming in through the lists from the Abolish the Welsh Assembly Party as well, which is an electoral strategy they may want to do. But of course, I don't see really where it gets them. What I think it does is actually pander to the divisions that we're seeing now in Wales. And I think this is the big undercurrent now, is that we're having, in this populist mania, we're going to two radically alternative solutions to the problems. We've got people going to independence. We don't know anything about Welsh independence, really, apart from the Plaid Cymru Commission. You've got loads of people going there. And then you've got other people going towards the abolitionist sentiment of getting rid of Welsh representation in our own country altogether. And I think for the Welsh Conservative Party, it's very dangerous for us in kind of Welsh civic society for them to adopt the role, possibly, of being the main vehicle of the latter movement towards the abolitionist ranks. Because, it's easy to, disregard that, the Welsh Conservative Party is now turning into, an Anglo-centric party. But the reality is that they are a fundamental aspect of Welsh politics, and they have been for the last 20 years. And they are a big part of the reason that devolution has succeeded in Wales. They have the potential, if they adopt, and I think the right word now is whether they will really embrace it, because they've adopted a few candidates lower down on the regional list seats. It's whether they really harness it and decide, right, we're gonna go to this populist wing and we're gonna try and get a few more 100,000 votes. If they do that, I really think that Wales will become a really massive melting pot of division, where, if Scotland goes and, all these hypotheticals happen, we're going to be sitting there with, people pointing in different directions, not knowing where to go. And, I sort of talked about this week in the Western Mail, the possibility that we'll be tied to England. And I'm an Anglophile, but I think that is what would satisfy a lot of people in the Welsh Conservative Party today. And I think that is incredibly dangerous for the future of our country.
Before we go on to the union as a topic in of itself, just wanted to talk a little bit about this sort of move to the right and these new candidates a bit more with you, Theo. You could call the new Conservative Party the RT Party, following a Republican model. Where do you think the future of the party lies in terms of like potential future leaders and things like that? Do you think that this young core of candidates that seem to be coming through now represent sort of sustainable future for the party, or do you think this is sort of a flash in the pan populism?
Well, I think, we'll go on to the union, but I think it will depend on what happens elsewhere, because they're actually turning into an ideological vehicle more than a political party. So I think it'll depend on, what happens elsewhere, whether, the forces in Scotland are tamed and, all these sorts of things. You're right to say as well that the party membership and the young people coming into the party as well are increasingly devo-skeptic. Of course, it's not to sort of, someone like me or anyone else looking at Welsh politics is not to disregard that and overlook it. For me, the disappointment comes into the fact that it shows a sort of lack of enthusiasm to participate in the whole democratic system. And I think, for me, if you look at the last 10 years of, if you look at the future of the Welsh Conservative Party over the last 10 years, it's been very difficult at each juncture really to see a leader emerging like a Ruth Davidson leader. This is a problem that's really been in the party since Nick Bourne was surprisingly chucked out of the Senedd in the elections after 2011. But I think since then, they've really struggled to find a leader that can give them direction as well. And I think we've talked about the fact that the group don't represent their members especially on the devolution question, but that might change. I think since 2010, 2011, and that kind of gang of Bourne and Melding leaving, it's been really difficult to see a leader sort of taking them on a concrete path. Because even now, we had Paul Davies as leader, but he wasn't really, he wasn't really embracing the abolitionist sentiment at all. He was kind of really walking a tightrope, and it sort of meant that you bred this kind of radicalism within the party, which then went one way rather than the other. So I think now, if you look, the future of the Welsh Conservative Party is incredibly difficult to predict. I don't really see, if I'm honest, who would be the successor to Andrew R.T. Davies, for example. If you ask me now, I honestly couldn't tell you who would succeed him. I don't think he'll be in the role personally for very long. And that's, I think, a big question as well, is, who is going to be the next party leader? Of course, they've technically got 3 in Wales already. That's another issue that they don't want to address. And, I think back to last summer, and I had a debate with Andrew R.T. on the Sunday Supplement programme on Radio Wales, and actually it was a really good-natured debate when I kind of called at the time for, essentially a greater shift to what we had seen previously. And, I know that my idea of the Conservative Party of Wales as a pragmatically progressive pro-devolution party is not popular in the grassroots, although I still maintain it'd get them elected if they tried. I remember having that debate, and Andrew actually, pointing out that it's, it is really strange to have the situation where, I think David Melding said it in one of his blog posts that, or the last of the Unionists post he does on Twitter, that if you had a Martian come down from Mars to say to the Welsh Conservative Conference, take me to your leader, they'd all be pointing in different directions. And I think that genuinely is a huge issue, and that will influence where the party goes. You do need someone like a Ruth Davidson, somebody young, energetic, radical, who is holding the likes of nationalists, in Ruth's case, the SNP, to account. I think if you had that sort of leader, that small c conservatism in Wales would actually be an unstoppable force against a Welsh Labour Party, which has had an easy run. And I think if they wanted to be a part of that democracy and really go for it, they could. But unfortunately, I don't think over the next couple of years we're going to see that Welsh Conservative Party of old returning anytime soon.
I totally agree with you on so much of that, Theo, particularly the bit about where's the next leader of the Conservatives coming from. It's there are people there, but no one jumps out to replace Paul Davies, and you can't think really of anyone jumping out to replace RT in the foreseeable future. You obviously wrote today in the Western Mail about a lot of this and the union and where we're going, and that followed on from what the Times published last Sunday about the fragile nature of the union. Do you want to talk a little bit further about what you wrote today and about how the unstable nature of the union, and where do you think the Welsh Conservatives are on this?
Yeah, of course. I think for me, after reading the polling in the Sunday Times, it wasn't surprising. Obviously, many academics pointed out that this is just basically the next poll, which has been consistent throughout, showing that support for Scottish independence is massive, relatively anyway, to a few years ago. And then obviously you've got support for a border poll in Northern Ireland, United Ireland. And for me, it sort of raises questions, obviously, about the future of Wales and where we sit in all of this, because, I am not somebody who is, naturally a Welsh political nationalist. I think everyone in Wales actually is a soft nationalist, is my theory, that everyone basically loves, Welsh rugby, and everyone, even if you don't speak the language, loves the language. We all love Wales. And I think that was a lot of my upbringing, actually, as well. But I think now, obviously, we've had this situation where the possibility of Scotland leaving, and I think they will, I really do. It's not unstoppable. It's not unstoppable yet, but I think we're getting to a close point. And the solutions that we have to stop them going are coming from the Labour Party at the minute, unless you think Boris Johnson sticking Union Jacks on packets of eggs is going to do the trick. The solution that Gordon Brown, even the likes of Mick Anthony, and sort of subtly supported by the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, of this radical federalism, just sticking radical on the front of it obviously makes it even more radical. I think it's something that the Scots, will never go for, because I think something like federalism will tie you to something called the UK. And I think this idea of the union being centralised in Westminster is completely repugnant to the Scottish nationalists, and they will never go for it. So my piece this week in the Western Mail sort of looked at, if Scotland goes, what happens to this federal model, this alternative to independence that's being put forward at the minute? And for me, I think it is something that it's something that's not going to work, because if the Scots don't take it, nobody takes it. I think the Welsh right now would be very happy to take a federalist model, actually, because we need to remember that we are a country that is pro-union. We are very happy to embrace Welshness, whatever that means, and Britishness, whatever that means, together. We're very happy to be a part of a political union, but also a cultural and social union that is sort of encapsulated under this guise of Britain. For us, the question is now, and it ties back to this sort of Welsh Conservative Party and where they stand. They're obviously pro-unionist. They'll do anything to keep Wales attached to England, in my view. The question is now is whether Wales, in the end, will be sitting, on our hands, really, just waiting for something to happen. Scotland goes, Northern Ireland goes, and Wales is just sitting there with England thinking, oh, right, well, here we go again. This is 1282 all over again. It's going to be a really, really difficult situation, for us as a country, because I just don't think a United Kingdom of Wales and England, as I put it in the piece, is practical or feasible. But I think, the onus is not just on those unionists in the Welsh Conservative Party to sort of justify how the union works at its present time or to suggest how it could be reformed. The onus is also on the likes of Plaid Cymru and, Yes Cymru, if you think that they should have a role in this, to paint a picture of an independent Wales. And by that, I mean in a confederate system across Britain, because that's what most people actually support, I think. It's a really complex web, but I think the central element of what I was asking was, what is Wales, I think, as a country, and actually our progressive politicians, what are we going to put forward which is realistic? Because now I think the genuine approach is pray that Scotland doesn't leave so we don't have to do anything. Because when it comes to that, it's going to be so hard for the likes of, Mark Drakeford, although, he's shown himself to be quite pragmatic about the whole thing. It's going to be really hard for a lot of unionists, as they stand right now, who are pragmatic unionists, to then say, right, we're going to have an independent Wales in that way. And I think by that point, it might even be too late. So, it's kind of a warning in some sense, the way I put it, that we're really facing a situation now that Wales is obviously behind on the constitutional debates that we're having across the UK, and that's a symptom of our, historic ties to England over 800 years. But it's also the fact that, lots of people do like things like the royal family in Wales, and they like the institutions that we've been given. We've been given, from the Liberal Party to the Labour Party, we were given representation and the welfare state and all these sorts of things. And I think if you went to some place across, you go to Merthyr Tydfil, Bangor, Pembroke or whatever, they are not I don't think everyone is talking about independence right now. And I think that's the issue that nationalists also have to overcome.
They do. It was a really interesting piece. So thanks for expounding on that. We're talking about the Conservatives here tonight to an extent, and the champion-in-chief of the union amongst them is Boris, currently in Scotland, travelling around the UK. So Boris has probably got his supporters in Wales amongst Welsh Conservatives. He is that popular figurehead, and he does get support from his natural supporters. But is he, as the kind of figurehead of the survival of the union, is that a problem to the wider kind of unionist movement in Wales?
Well, Boris is obviously a terrible advocate for the union, because the union, as envisaged by Boris Johnson, is not the union of 2021. It's the union of 1971. And the idea that you can persuade Scots in particular, but also a huge swathe of people who live in Wales, that the union is a good thing by telling them repeatedly how good a thing it is limited. You actually have to do the thing. You have to actually make the union work for people, and in the interest not just of people in Scotland and Wales, but in North and West England as well, in order for people to feel that they're invested in its future. And in order to do that, you have to be less Westminster-centric and looking after the square mile in London. And those are the things that this current UK government looks after more than anything else. So you have that, you have a losing paradox here. The people who could save the union are the people who are genuinely looking to reform it, but they're never going to win power in Westminster, or certainly not in the short term. And it is ultimately in Westminster, if you wanted to reform the union, where you have to gain power. The Scots have got a different approach, which is, well, we're not going to wait for the union to be reformed. We're going to take control of the steering wheel ourselves. The problem we have in Wales is that we have a person in the driving seat, or a series of people in the driving seat, who don't particularly want to take control of the steering wheel, but don't necessarily want to be a passenger either. So we're sort of freewheeling down the M4, and it's a dangerous position because we could be, innocent victims of, forces outside of our control, as Theo quite rightly puts. If someone asked me to put a bet on it, I think Theo is absolutely right. Much as it wouldn't be to the taste of many people, actually, I think we'll end up with essentially a United Kingdom of England and Wales that resembles the cricket team of England. Wales will be there, but it will be invisible and powerless. The question really is, how comfortable are we with that? Because obviously there are a huge swathe of the Conservative Party who are very comfortable with that. In fact, that's the optimal outcome for many of them. And actually, quite a lot of Labour supporters and a fair number of the PLP, I think, are probably quite supportive of that as well. So is it a question for Labour to lead the way? Well, we've heard sounds from Keir Starmer and Gordon Brown sound very familiar, but it's a kind of tune that never really kind of hits home, never gets people on the dance floor, so to speak. I just don't think it's not looking good. The question of leadership is not just one for who's going to lead the Welsh Conservative Party, who is going to lead that side of the political spectrum in Wales, but who is actually going to lead Wales? Because Mark Drakeford, for all his many skills, is not a natural leader. Plaid Cymru maybe have the man with the strongest leadership credentials, or at the very least ambitions in Wales, but I don't think he's been able to unify people outside of the Plaid curious voter base anyway, and it's just a real challenge. It's a challenge, and I think if anyone's got any answers, please send them on a postcard, and we'll do a podcast about it.
I think you're right, Richard. And I was struck really this week actually that Mark Drakeford gave an interview where he even said that he couldn't promise a federal UK to the voters of Wales. And I feel kind of sorry for him in some respects. I actually personally like Mark Drakeford. I think he's a good guy. I think he's done a good job throughout the pandemic. But I think it sort of showed that we really, at this current sort of system we have in the union, doesn't work, because we literally cannot get through to the Downing Street switchboard at times. And that is just, it makes for a terrible headline. It makes for a terrible story. And people just go and click on Yes Cymru, as you've seen on social media. And that's the sort of the snowball effect. But I think what you said as well is quite interesting about what the likelihood of it is happening. Because right now, I think if you had to be hypothetical about the whole thing, and I think it's been in the news this week as well. I saw a piece from Simon Brooks in Nation about an independence referendum. If you put independence for Wales, whatever that means, on the table, and sort of abolishing the Senedd right now on the table, I think really, if we were realistic, people would vote to abolish the Senedd. And I think that is a terrible condemnation on where we are in the state of our politics. Because I think, personally, I always think we should have a parliament to debate the issues that we have. So I think it's a really, it's easy to sort of gloss over it and, to talk, but I think there is genuinely a lack of urgency about the real possibility within 5 years. I remember David Melding said to you on your podcast that the phrase he said was that, the notion of Welsh independence, in the next couple of generations, that's not the right time frame. I think in the next 10 years, it's going to come to a head. And right now we are in that limbo, as you said, Richard, between the back seat and the driving seat. And there is nobody right now who's willing to put the seatbelt on and just go in one direction. And I think it's really, really challenging for us as a country as well.
Yeah, this is what baffles me. And Labour in the UK, the English Labour Party, and Labour in Wales keeps coming up with ideas, but never actually either campaigns on them or puts them into action. And it feels to me that this sense of urgency, I think Theo is absolutely right, the sense of urgency is there because Scotland could be gone, or at least have a foot out the door this year. And I just think, well, if Labour is genuinely serious, where is the urgency?
No, it's ridiculous, isn't it? And I think we've all been to events or read pamphlets and papers galore about Labour's plan for a radical future, reformed union. And it never goes anywhere because no one really cares. It's not really the average Labour member's or politician's bread and butter issue. They don't like talking about questions of national identity. They don't like talking about state in that way. They're quite happy to talk about statism and things like that, but not the state and the nature of it. So I don't think there's any real urgency to talk about it because they don't really want to talk about it or really understand it in huge detail. What you're seeing now in the Welsh Labour-backed report, let's be perfectly honest, that radical federalism thing, although it's not officially backed by the party, the amount of cabinet members who have been talking about it as though that's the done deal, end of story, future plan, gives you the indication that it's been pre-planned or at least pre-agreed. They've done that to try and stop people who support independence or sort of a more confederal model at the very least kicking off. And they talk about a dialogue, and they talk about a plan, and they talk about proposals. Then they also talk about citizens' assemblies. Don't see how those two quite mix together, but anyway. And it's like a done deal. It's a done deal. They seem to think this is it now. We've stopped our nationalist wing complaining, which it has really not done. And they think that's fine. We'll just get into government and we'll implement that. Forgetting, of course, the huge Scotland-sized hole in that plan, that they won't ever get into government without winning Scotland back, and they can't win Scotland back without something better than what they're planning on that question. And they'll both fail to address the real issue, which is Scotland's claim of right. But that's where all their voters have gone in Scotland, is to the SNP. And they're not going to win those back by just trying to ignore the constitutional issue when over half, nearly 60% of the country want to go. So Labour can't implement that radical federalism plan without being in the UK government. They can't get into the UK government without Scotland. Very difficult anyway. And even if they did, I have absolutely no faith that what they would actually do is try and sort out the union. Because when we had a majority of 179 in 1997, we didn't do anything with it then. We could have ploughed through huge sweeping reform to the UK state. We could have completely done electoral reform, etc. as well, and we didn't because it wasn't a priority. And if we won election again, I don't think it would be a priority then. And what you see when you listen to Mark Drakeford this week is that what power do you have to offer Welsh voters federalism? None at all, because the constitution is reserved and we can't do anything about it. So essentially, this is a begging bowl to UK Labour to please recognise what we're asking for if you get elected, which we know you won't. So thanks anyway.
That's a pretty good answer there from that. Where do we go from that? It's he's kind of blown my Scotland questions out of the water. Theo, do you want to comment on Matt's soliloquy there?
Yeah, I hate to be a committee of yeses, but obviously I completely agree with Matt as well. I think it's a great assessment actually of where Labour is. I mean, there's a couple of points actually which are interesting. Is that Keir Starmer was totally in agreement with Boris to going to Scotland today, and I think it really upset everyone on Call Keir and LBC. My mum was outraged; she couldn't believe it. I mean, I think you mentioned Scottish Labour, obviously they're completely irrelevant now. I think the interesting bit, actually, to go back to the Conservative Party is what Douglas Ross and all those guys get up to. Because the Scottish Conservative Party, I know, a couple of activists there and people associated with the party. They're quite pragmatic, they're quite sensible. And Douglas Ross obviously has been a kind of sensible voice in the whole debate because he basically told Boris Johnson, please don't come to Scotland and don't be a part of it, because he realises that they're in a really, really terrible state. Obviously, the Welsh Labour model of federalism, first of all, nobody knows what that actually means and what's the difference with confederalism in terms of this Benelux model that Adam Price and everyone is talking about all the time. It comes back again to this Conservative Party and what their proposals are, because the Labour Party, of course, are not in power. If they were in power, they probably wouldn't do anything anyway. I mean, I think somebody said, I think it might have been Richard Wyn-Jones put on Twitter that I think Stephen Crabb actually gave more devolution to Wales than Gordon Brown ever did. And really, it is up to that Conservative Party, which is apparently being advised by Gordon Brown, via Michael Gove, exchanging notes and, the future of the union, what shall I put in my Telegraph piece and all this. And really, it is whether the party in London comes to the realisation that they have to adopt something like federalism. Because, I mean, you listen to some of the more liberal Conservatives in Wales, and they are openly speaking about federalism. First of all, you had devolution as an uncontrolled element of saving the union, and now you have this notion of federalism being written into the constitution of the UK. And, that is really where the debate is at now. I mean, I think it's a disaster really for Welsh Labour in the sense they can't really change anything. And they've been this, stronghold of Welsh politics for 100 years, so important to the development of our national life. and they have absolutely no control of where it goes. Look at the UK Labour Party now. They lost Scotland 5-6 years ago, really, and they haven't had it back since. So it really is, whether there is that transition to adopting Labour policy from Downing Street, which I think would be a massive step. But even then, would it make a difference? I'm not so sure.
I'm genuinely fascinated by the people who advocate federalism. Certainly, this kind of idea of a federalism within England, as well as a federalism including Scotland and Wales, because we had this experience in Wales where even under, or particularly so under, the Labour government 97 to 2010, Wales had to fight tooth and nail to improve the dodgy devolution settlement of 97. And actually, the idea that within England, this UK government or any future UK government is going to be willing to cede legislative power to the north of England or the west of England, it seems bananas to me. I mean, we still don't have any significant control over matters related to justice in Wales, despite having to supply all of the services related, connect into the justice system. We don't have any say in it, nor policing either. And the idea that any UK government of any colour would say to the north of England, sure, under your own directly elected mayors or whatever, feel free to pass laws about this or that related to any of these serious matters. It's for the birds to me. I don't see any universe where a UK government makes that decision. And I don't see any universe where any party genuinely puts that in its platform. And I was joking with somebody on Twitter today, the only party that's consistently advocated federalism is the Liberal Democrats, the Liberals as was, and 100 or so years later, they still don't have a workable plan for England. So, if you've been campaigning for it for a century and you still haven't got past writing the title and underlining it, there is no plan, surely, that can come out for the future of England that looks massively different to what this UK government is kind of already doing, which is kind of piecemeal, low-level devolution to cities and local government.
If you had a federal England, you'd end up with a first minister more powerful than the prime minister, or at least certainly a situation where there is more attention put on the actions of the English first minister than the UK prime minister. You'd end up with a Yeltsin-style situation in Russia. The idea that you could federalize England as one solid block is for the birds, and the idea that you could split it up is for the birds too, because no one wants it. If you had asymmetric legislative blocks with different powers in each different area, they'd hate that too, because they'd be like, why have they got more power than we have? Why have they got more power than we have? We want more power. So you have to split it up and give each of these blocks a sort of relatively powerful parliament, or it will just fail anyway. And they're never going to do that. They're never going to cede power. Look, it took forever for them to give us the Wales Act, and that's not great.
I think that's right. And also just look at what happened during COVID with Andy Burnham and everything going on in Manchester. And then this is it, obviously, because it's easy to forget the debates about the union and the fact that actually lots of the problems and the fact that it's so centralised. And even in England, lots of people just speaking to me just couldn't believe the way that they were sort of framing like how Manchester was treated, how Manchester was treated by London. And it's just, you're thinking, you're looking at everything going on. You're Andy Burnham sort of basically begging for money outside. And they wouldn't even give it to, England's, second or third city. And then there's a prospect now that we're talking about federalising everything. I mean, it's really complex. And I think, obviously, like you mentioned, I think you had Jane Dodds on previously as well. Clearly, obviously, I've been listening to all the podcasts.
Thank you very much.
But, I think she actually, like you said, she hadn't really, I think, not to, misquote her or anything, but I think she basically didn't have an answer for a federal England. And that is quite a massive thing that even then it's just one of these catch-all terms to be used in politics. Oh, we're gonna have a massive economic recovery. We're gonna have a federal system. We're gonna transform the lives of people. It doesn't actually mean anything. And I read Nick Antonou and the sort of quasi-Welsh Labour pamphlet, and it's an introductory pamphlet, really. It's good. We're all saying that it's not going to work simply because we just don't know what they're actually proposing. And that's, if they gave us a plan, that would be a useful thing. And I think it also has to be the case that they need to approach the issue slightly differently as well, because I think Gordon Brown basically has said we need to save the UK, but it actually hasn't asked what the union is for. And I think it's kind of putting the chicken for the egg. And it's really, really difficult to essentially say we're going to have another constitutional convention, which means we're going to give you X amount of powers again, and then come back to us in 5 years with demands for another referendum. We'll give you more. And I think obviously we've come to a point now where we have an incompetent government in Downing Street that is literally gone to Scotland today saying nobody cares about an independence referendum. And they are kind of not really doing much. You've got a Labour Party which is not going to win the next general election, most likely, and won't be able to implement anything. And then you've got poor, gallant little Wales, which has got, a pretty popular First Minister saying, we should probably give everyone more powers and treat the nations with respect. I'd like to join your Cobra meetings. And no one's listening to him, genuinely now as well. That is a terrible thing, no matter what political party you support. I think the predicament we're in. I mean, I really say this, I try and be fair, in my analysis, but I think it is really, really difficult, the situation we're in. I don't think, you sometimes have a lot of people in certain parties we've mentioned tonight who really revel in the fact when things go wrong for our government in Cardiff. I mean, I think we really, really need to realise that we're in a terrible state in the midst of this pandemic, economically and in a public health sense. And when we look at the future of this country, and it's going to impact a lot of people, we're really divided, and there's no one really to unite us. We haven't got the mechanisms, we haven't got the media to do so. And it's really, I'm really painting a bleak picture on a Friday evening for all of you. But I think that's genuinely that's where we are. We've talked so much about it, but I just don't think none of us have any solutions for it, which is the most worrying thing.
Although not necessarily a huge number of people participate as a percentage of the population, but I think there's a very healthy intellectual debate about the future of Wales and the future of Union, be it in the Welsh Twitterverse or elsewhere. But I do think, exactly as you said, Theo, we have to deal with the world as it is rather than as it could be in theory. And I think in that light, I'd probably kind of like to ask what your take is on what do you think the reality is that will happen over the next 12 months or so in Wales and Scotland with regards to both, our two key subjects tonight, the Conservative Party and the future of the Union?
Well, I think in terms of the election in May, I don't see a great deal changing in terms of the polls. And what I mean by that, you're going to have a Welsh Labour Party winning the most seats. I think that's pretty obvious. Probably not outright majority, although I think, it depends on how the vaccine rollout goes. 1 week I was writing how terrible everything was, and then a week later they're the best in the UK. So I'm very, very accurate as a political commentator. And then I think you're going to have Plaid Cymru and the Conservatives fighting for the second spot. And I still maintain this, that if both parties pulled their socks up and wanted to get Welsh Labour out because they're so terrible, they could do it. And that makes it really interesting. But I don't think it's going to happen. So I don't think it's a huge deal going to change. And we'll have Mark Drakeford coming back for a couple of years as First Minister before he hands on to Vaughan Geffin or Ken Skate. In the midst of that, then, we've got the situation where we're looking really an SNP government with a massive majority in May. And I think that is going to pose a lot of questions for the government in Westminster, but also for us in Cardiff. What we will see then, as we've seen already, is this discussion about what is the referendum we're going to have. Are we going to make you do Catalonia? Which I think, for the record, would be a disaster because it would just be discredited by everyone. I think Douglas Ross was calling it a wildcat referendum, and now that's been picked up in every single media outlet. Everyone's calling it a wildcat referendum. So you can see, where the narrative goes from there. But I think you will, in the next 12 months, we'll have that SNP majority, and very likely we will have a referendum, the next couple of years in Scotland, because the pressure will be just immense on Downing Street. And I think then there will be a shift, I would hope, from the Welsh Labour Party, because I think, you touched upon it before, obviously, on these podcasts, and you see it in all these debates all the time. It really is, I think, the Welsh Labour Party, the most instinctively Welsh party we have in Wales. Has been so central to our, society and the development of our civic society. It is they who will shape where we go next, I think. And if Mark Drakeford, if there's a referendum called in Scotland, will we call for one in Wales? And how will we envisage Wales's role in a new union or a new confederal model of pooling resources and all these kinds of things that people talk about across Britain? But I think it is very uncertain. There's still that possibility, remember, that the SNP implodes with Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, fighting each other. I think Alex Massey wrote in The Spectator today, looking at essentially, nobody makes the case for leaving the Union than Boris Johnson, but there's nobody that really could destroy the independence movement other than Nicola Sturgeon. And I think there's so many variables that are there. But I think essentially we're going to come to this juncture where the constitution of Britain and the UK is at its head. And I think then, although we won't see political change in Cardiff Bay, I think there might be that moment that another terrible referendum we'll have to have, where we'll talk about all these things over again. But I mean, I think we're coming to a point now where Wales actually is going to have to, I said that, Wales should wake up before, but it's kind of hard to speak to 3 million people at once. I think we will have to decide eventually, though, what is our place? Is it with England? Is it within a confederal model of a new Britain with England and Scotland, which I think personally is the most likely thing and probably the best thing that we can do right now to pool resources and so on? It's going to be very, very difficult. So we've had Brexit in 2016. We're very likely to have Wexit, but we just don't know when, don't know what it will look like, and don't know how long it will last. So it's going to be very, very exciting.
Kerry?
I think we go. Scotland will have the referendum. Where that leaves Wales and the rest of the UK, who knows? I think there'll be further devolution. I think Theo put my side on it. I think the confederal kind of approach. The problem is there isn't an obvious solution to come from. Conservatives in Wales, I think we've spent a lot of time talking about the move to the right, but I'm just reflecting on some of the guests we've had on the pod from the Conservative Party. We've had Emma Wildhail, we've had Amanda Jenner, James Davis. It's more than just those that have been on the social media splash in the last few weeks that make up the party. And you have got Lauren Jones in South East Wales, Natasha Askar. There are more candidates out there than we're just focusing on. So I think it's not as bleak as what it might be portrayed. And Wales has got a strong Conservative background. 20 to 30% always vote Conservative, come rain or shine. So they're a big part of our civic makeup. And, they always will be. So we want to just get the best out of that part of our population.
I'm not very happy about my prediction, but it's one I'm pretty nailed on for, is that I think nothing that's happened in the last few weeks will really matter for the Welsh Tories. I think they're going to have a really good Senedd election and be really well placed if they need to or really want to have some sort of compact with Plaid. Not that I think it's likely, but it could happen. But certainly they'll do well enough that any other formation of government would require a coalition or a compact on the other side. And I think that the UK government will reject a referendum in Scotland. And I think that the only way that Scotland gets a legal, internationally recognised referendum is when one of the parties needs them for votes in the Commons. That's it. They're going to keep saying no because the two major parties in the UK level don't want them to go. The Tories for reputational reasoning and Labour for electoral ones. They don't want them to go. So they're not going to grant them a referendum they know they're going to lose. Unless something seriously changes in the polling or the electoral maths up in Scotland, it's not going to happen. So although I'm not happy about the prediction, I think the Conservatives are going to go from strength to strength in the next few years, no matter what happens. I think you've seen through coronavirus that their polling has stayed pretty much exactly the same. Dropped a bit when Barnard Castle happened, but since then, it's been absolutely solid at a sort of higher end of the 30s, lower 40s. And strangely, actually, I think that the Scottish Tories having Douglas Ross, a perfect candidate to be First Minister in an independent Scotland. He seems to get it. I don't think it's going to really matter because they're going to come second and have about a third of the seats of the SNP. But he seems to understand the need to be a distinctly Scottish Conservative party. And if only we had something like that down here, it would be better for Wales and better for Welsh democracy.
And on that note,
that was spot on, actually. Really, really did sum up that.
I will take the liberty, if I may then, Matt, of wrapping up and saying thank you to Theo for joining us this evening. Thank you to Kerry and Matt and all the espressos Matt has obviously drunk today. So if anyone's interested in hearing more about what you have to say, Theo, where can they find you and read your writings?
In the deepest, darkest depths of Welsh Twitter, you might find me tweeting out on, I think it's Theo Davies-Lewis, but that's where most of my stuff goes. And then otherwise in, the usual outlets that people can comment abuse on. So we've got Spectator, Nation, and all the like. So there will be plenty ahead of May for everyone to disagree with me on, which I hope they will.
To be fair, there aren't many people who get to write for both The Spectator and Nation.
I know,
so
it's an interesting mix. I try and hyperlink when I can, just to sort of really confuse the editors, which is always fun.
The Hiraeth blog is also available as a platform for writing on Theo.
Yeah, well, he's never offered, so I'd love to if you're willing to have me.
I think
Definitely.
Very kind of you, thank you.
Matthew Hexter, where can people find you on Twitter?
They can find me on Twitter at Hexter101, Hexter 101.
And Kerry?
It's the very unprofessional Kerry the Viking, but there's a history to that. Twitter's not meant to be for this professional platform, but it's Kerry at Kerry the Viking.
And I'm to be found at Mimosa Cymru. So thanks once again to Theo and the lads for the podcast this evening. If you're enjoying the podcast, please like and subscribe in your podcast player of choice. And you can find Hiraeth on HiraethBlogCymru on medium.com, HiraethBlogCymru on Facebook, and at HiraethBlog on Twitter. How did I do, Matt?
When did we agree? When did we agree you were wrapping up? I haven't done that yet.
It's inevitable. It's inevitable.
Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.